It was on a sullen Thursday in November, when the fog lay so thick upon the Thames that the very lamps on Westminster Bridge glowed like fading embers, that we received the visitor who would draw us into one of the most curious puzzles I ever had the privilege or misfortune to observe at close quarters. Sherlock Holmes had not spoken in nearly an hour. He was sprawled with his usual indifference across the settee at 221B Baker Street, eyes closed, fingers steepled just beneath his sharp nose, as though in a trance. Outside, the street was silent but for the occasional rattle of a hansom cab, muffled by mist. I, for my part, was seated near the hearth with a medical journal in one hand and a cup of tepid tea in the other, growing steadily more annoyed at a particularly haughty article on gastric disorders, when a rap-rap sounded on the door below. Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread passed along the hallway, and a moment later she appeared with her usual combination of exasperation and curiosity. Another client, Mr. Holmes, though I must say he's brought no card and wears the look of someone who's lost both sleep and manners. Show him up, Holmes said, without so much as opening his eyes, and kindly prepare a pot of coffee. If you would be so good. Moments later, a young man entered, though I hesitate to call him that, for he bore the nervous tension of someone aged before his time. His coat was rain-soaked at the cuffs, his spectacles slightly askew, and his gloved hands trembled as he fumbled to remove them. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, though he was already inside the room. Holmes opened his eyes, sat upright, and nodded. "To the client, to sit, Mr. Elric Fenworth," the man said, though his voice cracked over his own name. "Clerk at Bell and Portman Solicitors, Aldersgate Street." "Indeed," Holmes replied, though I would have deduced that without your confirmation. The young man blinked. "How the residue of sealing wax on your left sleeve suggests a professional correspondence handled in bulk. Your coat of Scottish tweed with a burgundy lining was tailored by Wilkins and Sons, which has a long-standing contract with the legal clerks of Bell and Portman. Your spectacles were recently repaired with thread, not for vanity, but economy, suggesting you are a junior, not a partner. Shall we continue?" Fenworth looked somewhere between alarmed and amazed. "Please do. Your problem," Holmes said, "concerns a bell that rang at an improper hour and a man who did not respond as he should have." This time Fenworth went white. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, exactly." I leaned forward, utterly lost. "What bell, Mr. Fenworth?" The clerk composed himself, fingers knotting together as he sat at Bell and Portman. He began, "We maintain a small lodgment at the back of the offices. 3 clerks live in rotation there, as the partners believe in long hours and fast dispatch." Holmes nodded in approval. "This past Monday night, just before 10:30, the night bell rang. It is rarely used, except in emergencies. Clients occasionally call in legal distress, inheritance issues, police notices, business, seizures. When the bell rings, it sounds both in the sleeping quarters above and in the hallway below." "A mechanical bell," I said. "Yes, and timed. But you say it rang early." Fenworth swallowed. "Exactly 1 hour early. You see, it was not due to be tested, as per regulation, until 11:30. "A test, then?" I asked. "That was my first assumption. But when I descended the stairs to investigate, I found the bell still vibrating in its glass housing, and no one at the door, no letters, no footsteps in the fog." Ghost stories, I muttered. Not quite, Holmes said. What makes this peculiar, Mr. Fenworth, he continued, is not the bell itself. It is what happened afterward, is it not? Fenworth nodded. When I returned upstairs to the lodgment, I found my fellow clerk, one Harold Thimbleby, missing. Holmes raised a brow. Gone entirely. His bed was untouched. His shoes remained by the hearth, but he and his coat were nowhere to be seen. And he did not return? No, sir. Not the next morning. Not since. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Have you informed the police? The firm did, but they believe Thimbleby left of his own accord. He was due to stand trial for a minor embezzlement charge, petty cash from the partnership trust, but the case was not serious. Still, they assume he fled to avoid scandal. Holmes tapped his fingers against the side of his chair. And you believe otherwise? Fenworth looked up, and now his voice was soft, almost childlike. I believe he was taken. The room fell silent. Outside, a church bell rang. 11. Holmes stood slowly and walked to the window, where the fog clung like damp wool to the glass. A bell that rings too early, he murmured. A clerk who vanishes without trace. A firm that refuses to ask questions. He turned. Watson, put on your coat. Mr. Fenworth, you will accompany us. Where are we going? I asked. Holmes's eyes glittered. To Aldersgate Street, he said, and to the bell that ought not have rung. It was nearly midnight by the time we reached Aldersgate Street, and the fog had thickened into a sort of soft wool that deadened both sound and shape. The gas lamps glowed faintly, like distant fires on a battlefield, and even the horses seemed uneasy as they clattered nervously past the tall, iron-banded doors of warehouses and counting-houses shuttered for the night. Walked between Holmes and me, his nervous energy barely contained. His hands, stuffed into his coat pockets, clenched and unclenched rhythmically. I could hear the faint ticking of his pocket watch, or perhaps it was just the pulse at his temple, audible in the silence. This way, he said, leading us, along a narrow alleyway beside a tobacconist's and into a rear courtyard, where the entrance to Bell and Portman's clerk's lodgment stood. A brass plate by the door bore the initials of the firm. Just below, it was the small, glass-hooded box that housed the infamous night bell. It appeared innocuous, dull, slightly oxidized, the sort of detail one might pass without a glance. And yet, it had caused a man to vanish. Holmes regarded the bell housing without touching it. There are no marks on the glass, he murmured. No cracks, no abrasions, and yet it rang. He turned to Fenworth. You are certain it was this bell? Yes, Mr. Holmes. It's the only one connected to the outer door. Holmes crouched and examined the floor beneath the door. He held a match to the ground briefly, illuminating a web of scratches on the stone threshold. Interesting, he said. You see these grooves, Watson? I knelt beside him. Scraping of some sort. Could be a boot or a trunk. Not a boot, Holmes said, standing again. Too linear, too shallow. Something slid, and deliberately. We entered the lodgment. Inside, the air was warm but musty, faintly tinged with ink, candle smoke, and the crisp bitterness of new paper. The sitting room was modest, a low hearth, 2 threadbare chairs, a writing desk, but orderly. A shelf held legal volumes and case ledgers. The only personal touch was a small lithograph of St. Paul's Cathedral on the wall above the mantel. Fenworth led us upstairs. Thimbleby and I shared this floor, he explained. 2 rooms, opposite sides of the landing. His is here. He opened a door to reveal a tidy bedchamber with a single narrow window. The sheets were made, the rug swept. On the writing table rested an open book of law, Blackstone's commentaries, I noted, and beside it a pair of gloves, a folded letter, and a short length of twine. Holmes went straight for the gloves. He turned them over once, then slipped a hand inside. Still warm, he murmured. Fenworth paled. That's impossible. He's been gone since Monday. Warm to the touch of another, Mr. Fenworth. These were moved recently, perhaps while you were preparing for our arrival. Fenworth blinked rapidly, then looked away. I tidied a bit. I thought you might want to see things clearly. Holmes did not press the point. Instead, he picked up the twine, sniffed it, and tucked it into his coat pocket. Watson, he said suddenly, the letter. I stepped forward and unfolded the sheet. The handwriting was tight and angular, the ink faintly smudged. Harold, it must happen before the bell. If he arrives early, do not resist. There is no shame in being the one who opens the door. R. I read it twice before handing it to Holmes. He examined it briefly, then turned to Fenworth. Do you recognize the hand? No, though the initial, well, one of our senior clerks is named Rountree. Holmes said nothing, but his fingers drummed against the side of his coat. We returned downstairs, where Holmes paced slowly through the sitting room before pausing at the hearth. Where were you? He asked, when the bell rang. I was here, Fenworth replied, at the desk, reading a brief. And Thimbleby already in bed, I assume. His door was closed. Did you hear anything? Only the bell, then my own footsteps, and later, nothing. No door opening, no footsteps returning. Just ... silence. Holmes turned toward me. Consider the facts, Watson. A bell rings at an unnatural hour. A man vanishes, leaving behind all but his coat. A letter speaks of opening the door, but not of leaving. And a floor, he gestured upward, too quiet for any honest departure. Then you believe he never left the building? I believe, Holmes said, that Mr. Thimbleby may have walked straight through the door and into something designed to look like emptiness. We stayed another hour at the lodgment. Holmes examined the bell's wiring, tested the door's resistance, and even tapped the baseboards with his cane, listening for hollow tones. At one point, he startled Fenworth by crawling beneath the stairwell with a lamp, muttering to himself. At last, satisfied, he rose and motioned for us to leave. I have seen enough, he said. As we exited into the fog once more, I turned back to the quiet brick building and shivered. Holmes, I said, what do you truly think has happened? He lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. I think, he said, that this was not an accident. The bell was not a malfunction. It was a signal, one that was meant to go unnoticed, but arrived too early, and the man who vanished. Holmes's eyes narrowed. He did not vanish. He was summoned. The following morning dawned gray and thick with soot, the sort of morning that turns every coat collar into armor, and every man's step into a cautious calculation. Though sleep had visited me briefly the night before, Holmes, I suspect, had not closed his eyes at all. When I descended to breakfast, I found him at the hearth, with his violin in hand, but not playing. He merely held it upright like a cane, tapping the end of it rhythmically against the floorboards as he stared into the fire. He rose when I entered. Come, Watson. There's something I must show you. I had just sat down to a plate of cold ham and eggs, but I knew from experience that when Holmes wore that particular hollowness around his eyes, alert but inward, the case had begun to feed on him. The ham could wait. We made our way back through the city's web, this time toward the solicitor's main offices, not the clerk's lodgment, but the grander premises of Bell and Portman on Aldersgate Street proper. Holmes had sent a wire, ahead under his own name, requesting access to the records room and the partnership archive. It's not the missing man that puzzles me, Watson, he said as we walked. Men disappear often enough. They lie, they flee, they fall into disrepute or ditch. But it is the signal that troubles me. A bell wired to awaken urgency, rung deliberately and prematurely. That ... that smacks of orchestration. We arrived at the office around 9:30. The building itself was an elegant red brick affair with a row of stone gargoyles whose faces had long since softened with soot and rain. A thin clerk in pince-nez admitted us and led us through an oak-paneled hallway into a reading room that smelled of dust, polish, and legal ink. Holmes was all brisk efficiency. I should like to see your visitor ledger for Monday evening, he said, as well as any documents signed out by Harold Thimbleby in the last 7 days. The clerk blinked. That is highly irregular. And yet, Holmes said calmly, so is the disappearance of your colleague. Perhaps it was the firmness of his tone, or the glint of steel in Holmes's gray eyes, but the clerk complied, while he fetched the documents. Holmes wandered to the far end of the room, where an ornate grandfather clock stood ticking solemnly against the wall. He ran his hand along its casing. Did you notice, he said, that the bell housing in the lodgment was quite new, while the rest of the fittings were at least 2 decades old? I confess I did not. That's because you are a good doctor and a poor carpenter, he said. The bell was replaced recently, and not by the firm's standard contractor. That was a local job, quick and crude. The clerk returned with the ledger and a small sheaf of papers. Thimbleby signed out 3 case files on Friday, he said. 1 civil dispute, Harper v. Harper, a family inheritance, tangle, and 2 corporate transfers, all routine, and the visitor log. The clerk handed it over. Holmes scanned it rapidly. Only for names on Monday after 5 o'clock, he murmured. None of them criminal clients, no personal appointments, and none, his brow furrowed, none. With the initial R, he tapped the page. Who is E. Kendrew? A partner's niece, I believe. She came to retrieve a personal letter. Holmes nodded, but his expression grew tight. And no deliverymen, inspectors, tradesmen of any kind, none recorded. Holmes handed back the papers and turned. To me, we shall now visit the back corridor. This took some persuading. The clerk was hesitant to grant access to what he referred to as non-public quarters, but a few well-placed hints at scandal and a flash of Holmes's business card saw us escorted down a passage behind the records, room to a narrow hallway running along the building's rear dot. Here, the atmosphere changed. Gone was the polished wood and neat order of the public offices. The corridor was dim, with walls of exposed brick and a faintly musty smell. At the far end stood a nondescript door with a small transom window above. Holmes opened it. We stood, once again, in the rear courtyard, only now in the clarity of morning. I noticed something we had missed the night before. A faint smear on the stone flagging. Blood, I asked. Holmes crouched beside it, touched it with his gloved finger, and sniffed. No, ink. Ink. He nodded. India ink. Thick, commercial grade. Likely used for ledgers or legal calligraphy. Not something one carries idly about. And yet, here it lies, trailing in a single line from the door to the opposite wall. The trail ended at a metal grate. Holmes lifted the grate and peered inside. A coal chute, he said. Disused, by the look of it, and blocked from the inside. Could someone have escaped through it? Escaped, Watson. He gave me a look, or been pulled. Back inside the building, Holmes requested access to the maintenance logs. This time, he was less gentle. There is a pattern here, Watson, he said, as we waited. A bell modified, a trail of ink, a letter that instructs not to resist, but to open the door. All of it implies coordination, a scheme not merely to remove Thimbleby, but to use him in a precise moment. The clerk returned, flustered. There is no record of recent bell replacement, he said, nor any entry in the coal chute maintenance log. Then someone is lying, Holmes said flatly. As we prepared to leave, Holmes paused in the main hall and examined a display case set against the wall. Inside, it was a ceremonial brass bell, engraved with the firm's founding date, -1789, and beneath it, a short inscription. When rung, we answer. When silenced, we act. He turned to me. Watson, he said, have you ever known a bell to silence a man more completely than with its sound? I did not answer, because I had begun to understand what Holmes already feared, that Harold Thimbleby may not simply have disappeared into the fog of London, but into the silence of something far older and far more deliberate. That evening, after a late supper of cold beef and pickles, during which Holmes spoke little and chewed less, we returned once more to the sitting room at 2-1B. The fire had been set to a low but steady burn, casting a warm glow over the cluttered chaos of Holmes's books, clippings, and curious chemical contraptions. My friend, however, was not at peace. He stood before the hearth with his back to the fire, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half shut in the fashion that always signaled the workings of his astonishing mind. I had learned, through many years, not to interrupt him in these silences. Still, when he began to murmur, it was more to himself than to me, but I listened. There is something artificial in its innocence, he said. I set down my brandy. What is the case, he said, or rather, the way it was presented. To us, a man goes missing, a bell rings, a letter urges surrender, all seemingly discreet, but none of it truly inexplicable. He crossed the room and extracted a scrap of parchment from a folder on his desk. It was the note we had found in Thimbleby's room. It must happen before the bell. If he arrives early, do not resist. Holmes tapped it twice. This note is theatrical, he said. Overwrought, designed to imply inevitability, but it is also a decoy. That phrase, before the bell, is a flourish. The real message lies in the second line. Do not resist. Precisely. The writer knew Thimbleby might panic. That tells us the recipient was not complicit, at least not fully. The writer assumed fear, which means they also assumed surprise. But then, I said, how do we explain the preparations? The gloves, the folded coat, the carefully placed twine. Surely, Those imply intent. Ah, Holmes said, eyes brightening. But intent of whom? That is the question. Were those things left by Thimbleby, or for him? The distinction was chilling. Holmes moved to his chemistry bench, where he uncorked a small vial of dark fluid. I examined the ink we found on the stone outside the solicitor's building. India ink, yes, but with an unusual resin binder, not typical office stock. In fact, I traced it this afternoon to a printer in 7 Dials who specializes in pamphleteering, political, radical. Holmes confirmed, an anarchist, broadsheets, anti-parliamentary manifestos, the sort of literature that once littered the alleys after dark and found its way into students' pockets and constables' nightmares. You suspect Thimbleby of revolutionary sympathies? Holmes shook his head. No, but someone in his circle may be using the firm's machinery, or its access to pass messages in print. That ink on the ground wasn't spilled from a bottle, Watson. It was stamped. There were faint impressions. A plate fell, perhaps in haste, perhaps in confrontation. He turned back toward the fire, pacing. Consider the clockwork of it. A firm known for its discretion. A clerk who vanishes without a cry. A bell that signals something not to the house, but to outside it. And now, ink that links us not to law, but to rebellion. But Fenworth, I asked. He seems earnest enough. Alarmed. Too alarmed, Holmes muttered. He is either the most genuinely rattled soul in London, or the best amateur dramatist since Mr. Irving took to the stage. He sat down abruptly, fingers drumming on the arm of the chair. No, Watson, I believe we are dealing with a structured deception. Someone within the firm or tangential to it is orchestrating events for effect. The bell, the disappearance, the letter, all signals in a coded system, and we are not yet reading the language correctly. I sighed. It does rather feel like a stage play. Everyone in their place, hitting marks, waiting for a cue. Holmes nodded. Double quotes and the bell. Dear Watson, is that cue? Later that night, Holmes sat in total darkness for nearly an hour, save for the faint glow of his cigarette ember. I could not sleep. The fog outside had crept into my bones, despite the fire, and I found my thoughts drifting to poor Harold Thimbleby. Whether he lay now at the bottom of the Thames, or somewhere darker, behind locked doors, staring at nothing. Just as I began to nod off, Holmes spoke again. Watson. Yes. What do you make of Kendrew, the niece of the partner? I thought she seemed harmless. Harmless, perhaps. But she was the only visitor with no business listed. Retrieving a personal letter, so we are told. But who letters from a solicitor's office, in person, rather than by post? A clandestine exchange, or a couriered message, Holmes replied. One passed by hand, perhaps to Thimbleby, or from him. I sat up. You believe Kendrew may be involved? I believe, Holmes said quietly, that someone used her presence to move something through the building or out of it. And now I intend to find out what. He stood, tall and strange in the firelight. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall pay Miss Kendrew a visit. We arrived at the Kendrew residence in South Kensington beneath a grim sky of dragging clouds, the sort that seemed to press London flat. Miss Eleanor Kendrew lived with her aging father, Colonel Ambrose Kendrew, retired in a modest yet respectable 3-story house, with ivy climbing over the windows and a silver-plated knocker shaped like a lion's head. It was just after 11. When Holmes rang, we were greeted at once by Eleanor herself, a thin, quick woman in her early 30s, with pale hair swept tightly back and fingers stained faintly with ink. She wore no jewelry save a silver brooch at her collar, and her eyes did not flicker at the sight of Holmes's calling card. If anything, they hardened. "I suppose you're here about Mr. Thimbleby," she said at once. "You're not the first." Holmes's brow lifted. "No. A man came by yesterday evening, rather coarse, claimed to be with the Metropolitan Police, but he had no identification and seemed more interested in our study than in Harold." Holmes tilted his head. "And did you let him in?" "I did not," she said sharply. "I shut the door in his face. My father was upstairs and hasn't been well. I saw no reason to involve him in something so clearly insincere." "Very wise," Holmes murmured. "May we come in?" She hesitated, then nodded, standing aside. The interior of the house was exactly as one would expect from an old soldier and his spinster daughter: clean, spare, and almost aggressively dull. No books out of place, no lace askew. A single oil painting of a field hospital in Kandahar dominated the main hall. We were led into the drawing room. "I'd like to be clear," Miss Kendrew said, turning to face us. "I've already spoken to Mr. Fenworth. I went to the office Monday evening only to collect a private letter from my uncle. I saw Harold briefly in the corridor. He seemed distracted. We didn't speak beyond a greeting." Holmes folded his hands behind his back. "Was the letter addressed to you?" She hesitated the smallest pause, but Holmes caught it like a hawk sees the twitch of a mouse. "No," she said. "It was from my cousin, who is abroad, but sent to the office, as he feared the contents might be. Read, were it posted here." "May I see it?" "I no longer have it. No, I destroyed it." "Interesting," Holmes said softly. She reddened slightly, but held her ground. "It concerned personal matters." "I see," Holmes said. "And this cousin, he would not be the Mr. Oliver Kendrew who once stood trial in Vienna for circulating revolutionary literature?" The room seemed to freeze. Her eyes narrowed. "You know very well he was never convicted." Holmes gave a slight bow of the head. "Indeed, but innocence, in law, does not always imply distance from danger. Miss Kendrew, I believe your cousin used your name and your access to Bell and Portman to pass information to Mr. Thimbleby." "I know nothing of that." Holmes took a few slow steps around the room. "You yourself are not involved in any radical circles." She said nothing. Holmes examined a writing desk in the corner. Upon it sat a sheaf of paper, an envelope addressed in feminine hand, and a small ink bottle. He lifted the bottle, examined the contents. "India ink," he said. "Unusual formulation. It's mine. From 7 Dials. I purchase ink from many places." Holmes replaced the bottle, then turned back to her. "I am not here to prosecute your cousin," he said, "but I am here to find Harold Thimbleby. If you know anything at all, that could explain why a quiet clerk would be lured from his room with a cryptic note and vanish without trace, you must say so." She looked away just briefly. "I told you," she said. He seemed distracted. "I thought it was a personal matter, perhaps something romantic." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. "You're protecting someone," he said. "Bet. Much is clear." She did not answer. He stepped toward the door, then turned once more. "If you change your mind, Miss Kendrew," he said, do right. A word from you could prevent a tragedy or explain one. Back in the cab, I turned to him. You believe she's lying? I believe she is afraid, he said, and not without reason. But why shield her cousin? Because blood is thicker than law, Holmes replied. And because she does not yet know how far this web extends. That afternoon, we returned to the offices of Bell and Portman, where Fenworth introduced us to two other employees of interest, a nervous junior named Mr. Owenfield and a rather too-polished office manager named Miss Prudence Bligh. Mr. Field stammered his way through a bland account of Harold's last week, quiet, punctual, and perhaps a little glum, though that was apparently not unusual. Miss Bligh, on the other hand, was the sort of woman who seemed to have been born at a desk. Her dress was immaculate, her hair shaped like a question mark, and her answers were precise, but only to the point of dullness. I do not speculate about my colleagues' lives, she said flatly. Mr. Thimbleby was competent, if occasionally tardy. He left no files unattended and never spoke out of turn. Did he ever receive outside correspondence? Certainly. All clerks receive mail. I saw nothing out of place. Holmes leaned slightly forward, and yet he vanished. He said, leaving his gloves folded, his door unlocked, and a rope tied as if to secure a trunk that no longer exists. Miss Bligh, does that strike you as the behavior of a competent man? She paused, just a flicker of something in her brow. No, she said quietly, but it does strike me as the behavior of a frightened one. As we departed, Holmes handed me a folded scrap of paper. Take a look at this, Watson. It was a list, a short one. E. Kendrew, false name. Ink. Radical press bell, replaced. When. Shoot blocked. From inside Bligh mask. Field. Puppet. Holmes. Tapped the final line. We are dealing with at least 3 lies, he said. Possibly more. The question now is, who lies to protect and who lies to profit? I stared out at the soot-stained rooftops of London, the city that swallowed men as easily as fog swallowed street lamps. Somewhere out there, Harold Thimbleby had either vanished or been vanished, and the bell that rang too early was still ringing. In my ears, it was nearly dusk the next evening when I returned to Baker Street, having spent most of the day making inquiries of my own at Holmes's request. My efforts, which consisted largely of interviewing an unhelpful porter at Thimbleby's boarding house and being turned away at the British Museum, where Harold supposedly conducted occasional research, yielded little more than a headache and sore feet. When I entered our sitting room, I was greeted not by Holmes, but by a stout, red-nosed man with a salt-streaked beard and the rough boots of a Thames waterman. "Evening, Doctor," the fellow said, doffing his cap. I stared at him. "Have we met?" He winked and removed his false whiskers in one swift gesture. "Gracious heavens, Holmes." He grinned. "Forgive the theatrics. I've been prowling around the wharves all afternoon. Dockside, gossip, cheap gin, and an unpleasant conversation with a man who keeps ferrets. Have you found anything useful?" "Not much, but enough. Come, sit, Watson. You deserve the comforts of your chair after a day of noble futility." Once seated, he poured me a brandy and settled opposite, the shadows of the fire flickering across his now clean-shaven face. "I've had my eye on a man named Josiah Brant," Holmes said. "He operates a small printing press in the Arches, below Shadwell Station, one of many radical mouthpieces churning out underground newsletters, and he recognizes Thimbleby. I straightened. They were acquainted, not directly, he claims, but Brant swears he once printed a ciphered circular intended for a Mr. H.T., delivered through a courier, a young woman with pale hair and a brooch in the shape of a thistle. Miss Kendrew, indeed. She has been acting as a go-between, intentionally or otherwise. Holmes stood and moved toward the window, peering into the foggy street beyond. What troubles me is the silence, he continued. No ransom, no demands, just this clever orchestration of symbols, the bell, the letter, the missing man, and now a link to radical pamphleteers. He turned back. There's a method here, Watson, something deeper than a mere disappearance. I frowned. But why Thimbleby? Why not someone of importance? Holmes nodded approvingly. Yes, that's the right question. Why go to such lengths for a minor clerk? Unless he broke off. I waited. Unless Thimbleby wasn't so minor, Holmes said at last. Unless he knew something, or held something, and someone feared he might speak. He crossed to the desk and retrieved a bundle of folded garments, a faded gray cloak, a scuffed pair of boots, and a cap bearing the insignia of a local delivery firm. You intend to go out again? Tonight, he said, as a messenger. There's a certain tea shop near Covent Garden, frequented by Miss Kendrew on Thursday evenings. She sits near the window and reads French literature. Tonight, she shall receive a note. I raised an eyebrow. From whom? From Harold Thimbleby, Holmes said, with a smile that was all razor dot. At 8 o'clock sharp. I watched from across the street as Miss Kendrew entered the tea shop in question, a dainty, dimly lit establishment with small wooden tables and red velvet curtains. She wore a modest green coat and a slightly harried look, though she carried herself with the same determined grace as when we'd last seen her. 10 minutes later, Holmes, now disguised as a weary footman, entered with a folded paper and delivered it to her hand. I could not see her expression as she read it, but I observed the trembling of her fingers as she folded it neatly and slipped it into her sleeve. She paid her bill moments later and left without finishing her tea. Holmes returned to my side 10 minutes after that, slipping back into his coat and removing his cap. She believes he's alive, he said, and that he intends to meet her. But why? I wrote only this, he replied, producing a copy of the note. Is danger still? Meet me where we once saw the lion in chains. Midnight. I was about to ask what that meant when Holmes added, there is a statue in the crypt of All Souls Church, a lion sculpted in fetters. It is obscure, but memorable. I saw Miss Kendrew pause before it once when we passed that way last spring. You think she'll come? She must. Too much hinges on it. Her fear will drive her more than her caution. At midnight, we waited in silence within the cold stone crypt of All Souls, crouched behind the heavy tomb of some forgotten duke. The lion statue, carved in weathered marble, loomed nearby, its chains half broken by time, its eyes hollow. The minutes crawled, then footsteps, soft, hesitant. A cloaked figure entered, lantern in hand. Miss Kendrew. She approached the statue and looked around nervously. Her breath formed small clouds in the air. Then another figure appeared, not Holmes, a tall man in a dark coat, gaunt, imposing. He spoke low, but I could not make out the words. Miss Kendrew stepped back. The man reached toward her, and Holmes sprang. The confrontation was brief. The man, clearly not expecting resistance, stumbled as Holmes tackled him. sending the lantern crashing to the floor in a burst of sparks. I lunged forward, seizing Miss Kendrew by the arm and pulling her clear of the wreckage. The man groaned and struggled. Holmes pinned him with a knee to the chest and tore away his scarf. "Well, Mr. Owenfield," Holmes said coolly. "What a surprise." We turned him over to the constables just after 2 in the morning. Field, shaken and bleeding slightly, refused to say much. But the truth, it seemed, had begun to unravel. "Why Field?" I asked, as we walked back through the deserted streets. "He was always nervous," Holmes said, "but not merely in temperament. His fear was of discovery, not conscience. He posed as weak, yet followed Miss Kendrew in the dark and carried a blade in his coat. He was no mere clerk. He was the enforcer of this little network. But for whom, that Holmes said, we must still discover." By the following morning, London's fog had returned with almost theatrical flourish, seeping through door cracks and curling around lampposts like smoke from a slow-burning fuse. Holmes, having taken no rest, stood at our breakfast table, scribbling on the back of a banking receipt, one foot perched upon the coal scuttle. "I must ask you, Watson," he said without looking up, "what do you make of this list?" He turned the scrap toward me. Upon it he had written, "Miss Kendrew delivers ciphered letter stimbly. Receives cipher ink from 7. Dials bell cut before Firefield carries blade. No ransom silence. It looks like the outline of a conspiracy," I said. "Precisely," Holmes muttered, tapping the last line. "And what is the loudest thing about this entire affair?" I hesitated. "That nothing has been said." Holmes smiled faintly. "Exactly. This isn't a crime for publicity. This is a cleaning operation. Someone made a mistake. Someone spoke out of turn. Perhaps Harold Thimbleby discovered a hidden ledger or deciphered the wrong code at the wrong time. And instead of a cover story or a convenient accident, they chose erasure." He tossed the paper onto the mantelpiece, but they didn't expect Miss Kendrew to come forward, he added. Nor, I imagine, did they expect her to have feelings for the man. "She loves him?" I asked, surprised. "She fears for him," Holmes said, "and fears herself complicit. That is enough for guilt to manifest as love." Later that day, we called again upon Miss Kendrew, who, with visibly trembling hands, admitted what Holmes had already deduced. "Yes," she said softly, "my cousin Oliver asked me to deliver the packages. I never opened them. He told me they were letters to old friends of my late uncle, and that sending them through ordinary post might attract political attention." "Did you know the packages were ciphered?" Holmes asked. She looked up, eyes reddened. "Not at first, but I became suspicious. Once the ink smeared on my gloves. It wasn't ordinary ink. And Harold, he asked questions. He noticed, and you warned your cousin." "I tried, but he said it was harmless. That Harold was only a clerk." "But Harold wasn't only a clerk, was he?" Holmes pressed. "No," she whispered. "He was kind and observant. He said once that truth has a smell, and that someone in the office had begun to stink of lies." By mid-afternoon, Holmes had requested I accompany him to a small legal office off Fenchurch Street, whose name, Broadley and Crispin, meant nothing to me at the time. The clerk there was an aged, blinking man with a voice like parchment. "Mr. Thimbleby," he said, when Holmes inquired. "Why, yes. He came here 2 weeks ago to inquire about a sealed trust. A peculiar thing, really. A posthumous trust, filed by a Mr. Septimus Bell in 1892. set to expire precisely this month. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And the contents of that trust, confidential. But I can say, Mr. Thimbleby presented an authorization key. Very few individuals even knew the document existed. What did he do with it? He said he was returning it to his employer, that it might have been misplaced outside. I turned to Holmes in confusion. What possible reason would a dead man have for creating a trust to expire 13 years? Later, Holmes gave a short, sharp nod, because he knew something would be valuable then, not before, and someone feared Harold would discover what. We returned to Baker Street just as twilight began to fold itself over the rooftops. Holmes lit a single lamp, poured us both tea, and opened the morning's newspaper, which had arrived late. On the second page, tucked between columns on fisheries and foreign tariffs, was a single line: warehouse fire in Limehouse, no injuries. Local records lost. Holmes tore the article free and held it to the light. The fire, he said, was not about erasure of Harold's body. It was about erasure of evidence. Likely, Bell's trust pointed to something stored their records, perhaps, or encoded ledgers from the firm's early days. And the bell, Holmes exhaled. It rang too early, Watson. Thimbleby wasn't meant to reach the trust until after the fire had been arranged. Someone moved too quickly, and thus the trap was improvised. By the evening, Holmes had charted a complete web upon our chalkboard, Bell and Portman at the center, lines branching outward to Thimbleby, Miss Kendrew, the 7 Dials printer, the legal trust, and now a name circled twice in bold script. Portman, you suspect the partner? I asked, astonished. He has no alibi for the evening Thimbleby vanished, Holmes replied. He claims to have been at his club, yet no one remembers seeing him. And if the trust pointed to his early dealings, shady investments, perhaps, or stolen patents, then the motive becomes perfectly logical. Still, I said, we have no direct proof. Holmes's eyes darkened. Not yet. He stepped back and studied the board. But if I'm right, he said, Portman is preparing to vanish himself before we can tighten the net. I was about to respond when a knock sounded at the door. Holmes moved quickly. He opened it, and there, hunched against the threshold, soaked with rain, and looking very much like a man dragged from the belly of the Thames, stood Harold Thimbleby. The man in the doorway looked less like a clerk and more like a scarecrow dragged through a thunderstorm. He was pale, not with the ordinary pallor of fright, but with the washed-out hue of a man who had not seen sun or kindness in days. His eyes, sunken and rimmed in gray, blinked slowly at Holmes, as if uncertain whether he stood before a rescuer or an apparition. Mr. Thimbleby, Holmes said, without alarm, I rather expected you earlier. Thimbleby collapsed into the armchair nearest the fire without waiting for permission. I fetched a blanket and warm drink while Holmes, in his usual unceremonious fashion, drew the curtains, turned up the lamp, and began his inquisition. You were not burned, Holmes remarked flatly. No, Thimbleby muttered, voice hoarse, but I was meant to be. He pulled up his sleeve. A deep welt, halfway scabbed and raw, marked the inside of his forearm. I was kept in a storeroom below the warehouse in Limehouse, he said. They'd given me a sedative. I think it was laudanum. I woke just before the flames reached the crates. The fire was timed, but not for me. I don't think they meant to kill me there, only keep me silent until the place was destroyed. and you escaped. Spent 3 nights hiding in dockside alleys. Then I saw the article in the paper." He shook his head. "They think I know more than I do." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Let us not underestimate what you do know. Tell me about the trust." Thimbleby's fingers tightened around the teacup. It was an old record, dusty, misfiled. Portman had asked me to audit the archives. Said Bell's name might resurface because of some inheritance nonsense. But it was the date that caught my eye. Why would a trust open in 1892 direct funds to a warehouse rental that had ceased operation a decade earlier, and why continue paying? "Bell left more than money?" Holmes asked. "Yes," said Thimbleby. "He left blueprints, stamped and signed patent filings, and notes that implied something had been stolen. A design." Holmes leaned forward. "A design for what?" Thimbleby hesitated. "A type of recording mechanism for transmitting text across distance without telegraph wires." It was crude, but functional. I recognized certain diagrams that matched work I'd seen in recent publications. Watson blinked. "You mean like a wireless typewriter?" Thimbleby nodded. "Bell designed it years before Margrave's patent, but his notes vanished. And now Margrave sits on a government contract." "Which would explain," Holmes said slowly, "why Bell's original records had to be destroyed, and why anyone who found them had to vanish," I finished grimly. As Thimbleby rested, Holmes stood and paced with renewed urgency. I could see the machine of his mind revving faster, that peculiar rhythm of silence, gesture, and sudden utterance. "Portman," he said aloud, "was not simply the beneficiary of Bell's death. He was the architect. If the invention fell into Margrave's hands, it was likely through an intermediary. Portman profited from both ends, suppressing the past and selling the future." He spun toward me. "But why act now? Why burn the warehouse this week?" "Because the trust expired," I said slowly, understanding dawning. "Exactly," Holmes snapped. "The moment the trust matured, it legally transferred the remaining contents, including those blueprints, to Bell's nephew. But Harold reached it first, likely before Portman could intercept the notice, and that made him dangerous." "To a man like Portman," Holmes murmured, "a clerk with knowledge is far more dangerous than a lawyer without it." Just then, a soft knock came at the door. I stiffened. So did Thimbleby. Holmes motioned us to silence and stepped carefully to the threshold. Without a word, he opened it. Standing there, her gloves soaked and her cheeks blotched from cold, was Miss Eleanor Kendrew. She looked around the room, eyes wide. When she saw Thimbleby, she gasped, "Harold!" She rushed to him and fell to her knees beside the chair. I feared. Holmes let them have a moment. He stepped back, closing the door softly behind him. Miss Kendrew turned to us, eyes brimming. "I went to the church," she said. "He never came. I feared the worst. And then, today, a note arrived." She produced it. Holmes took the small folded paper. No signature. One line. "Too many bells. Too little time. Yours is next." I read it and felt a chill. Holmes's brow furrowed. "They're accelerating," he said. "Field failed. The fire failed. Now threats. Will they come here?" I asked. Holmes looked toward the window, where the fog thickened like curdled milk outside the gaslight's glow. "Perhaps," he said, "but they won't find what they're after." He turned to Thimbleby. "Need the original blueprints." "I hid them," Thimbleby said. Thimbleby smiled faintly, for the first time. Where no one would think to look. Holmes raised an eyebrow. In the bell, Thimbleby said, the iron bell, outside Bell and Portman's offices, hollow, unused. I slipped them inside, through a crack in the seam, the day I realized someone had followed me. There was a long silence, and then Holmes smiled, not with satisfaction, but with something cooler, more calculating. I must dress, he said. Watson, bring your revolver. Tonight, we retrieve the truth from inside the lie. The fog did not lift that night. It only thickened, as if London itself wished to shroud its darker instincts beneath a silken veil. I remember clearly how Holmes paced our sitting room like a caged animal, his steps quick but measured, his violin untouched, his pipe long cold. By 9 o'clock, he had rearranged the furniture twice, written 6 lines of notes, and struck each one through in frustration. He spoke to himself, though his words were not for me. I underestimated the ruthlessness, he muttered once. They burn instead of bargain, and yet they're clumsy, rushed, afraid. At past, he pulled down a heavy volume from the shelf, the early telegraphists of Surrey, and thumbed quickly through its dusty pages. Then he snapped it shut and threw it onto the divan. I need to think outside of time, he growled. I had seen Holmes this way only twice before. Once during the affair of the Ashcroft disappearance, and again when the Diogenes Club faced scandal from within. It was not madness that gripped him, but a kind of spiraling genius that fed upon silence, puzzles, and proximity to danger. He had eaten nothing since morning. He refused tea. When I asked if I might fetch Lestrade or an officer, he waved it away. They'll only blunder the matter, he said, and we must move before Portman does. And what of Miss Kendrew and Thimbleby? They will remain here under Mrs. Hudson's supervision. You and I will go to Bell and Portman's offices tonight. To do what? To cut the heart from a lie, he replied. We left Baker Street under the cover of mist and moonlight, the city drowned in a kind of echoless quiet. Holmes wore a plain gray coat and bowler hat, nothing of his usual flair, and carried with him only a folded length of iron wire and a single stub of candle. I brought my revolver, though I admit with no small amount of dread. The office of Bell and Portman was tucked just off Cornhill, at the edge of the financial district. Its frontage bore the usual stone stoop and frosted glass, but what we had come for lay above the lintel, a thick, rusted bell, blackened with soot and almost invisible in the night. We approached in silence. No one about, I whispered. Don't assume quiet means safety, Holmes murmured. They've watched this place longer than we have. He knelt, produced the iron wire, and began picking the side latch that led to the outer stairwell. Within minutes, we stood atop the narrow ledge beneath the bell, the city fog thick around us like a noose. The bell loomed large, its clapper long since removed. It seemed visible only in fragments where the weather had worn it thin. Holmes removed a small metal chisel from his pocket. I've loosened it once before, he said softly, but I never opened it. Tonight we do. With swift, careful movements, he worked along the rusted seam. Metal creaked softly, the kind of sound that wakes stray dogs, but not sleeping guards. Then a hollow click. He reached inside. From within the dead bell, Holmes retrieved a tight oilcloth bundle, no larger than a loaf of bread. He unwrapped it quickly, revealing sheaves of folded paper, diagrams, and a sealed envelope marked with the initials SB, before we could examine further. A sound behind us, footsteps, too quick, too quiet. Holmes stood, eyes narrowed. "Step back," he whispered. A figure emerged from the fog, trench coat, flat cap, and what appeared to be a glint of steel in his right hand. I raised my revolver. The man froze, but Holmes didn't wait. With a sudden move, he flung the oilcloth bundle behind me and lunged forward, catching the stranger off guard. A scuffle followed, silent but furious, and I moved in to assist. The intruder dropped his knife. Holmes had him by the collar, his knee against the man's chest, face mere inches from the assailants. "You are not Portman," Holmes said. "You're the errand boy, the cleaner." The man said nothing. Holmes reached into his coat and pulled free a small brooch, gold, finely worked. "Margrave's insignia," he said. "So, that's who paid for the fire." We bound the man with a length of curtain rope found within the office, and Holmes sent for Lestrade via a message boy from the corner telegraph station. When the inspector arrived, he was, as expected, half confused and half outraged. "You might have warned me, Holmes," Lestrade grumbled. "Instead, I find you beating a man senseless atop a solicitor's rooftop like some gothic melodrama." Holmes said nothing. Instead, he handed Lestrade the blueprints. "Take these," he said, "and seal them. You'll find that Portman not only benefited from Bell's death, but likely orchestrated it. And this man," he added, gesturing to the intruder, "works not for Portman, but for a third party, one with government ties and a preference for silence over scandal." Lestrade sighed. "And your proof?" Holmes pointed upward to the silent, hollow bell. "It was all in there," he said, "where only the forgotten could be found." We returned home just before dawn. Holmes did not speak. He lit his violin and played something slow, almost mournful, as Miss Kendrew wept quietly beside Thimbleby, and the fog began at last to lift. For the better part of that next morning, Holmes retreated into himself, while Miss Kendrew and Thimbleby took breakfast in the parlor, whispering like survivors of a shipwreck. Holmes remained seated in the window alcove, unmoving, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on the rising smoke. Beyond the rooftops of Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson brought him tea. "It went untouched, I believe," he murmured, as if to no one. "That we have a fish who knows he's in the net, but not yet who cast it." "What do you mean?" I asked. Holmes turned his head just enough to catch me in profile. "Portman didn't light the match," he said, "nor did he send the man last night." "You said as much," I replied. "Margrave's mark was on the brooch, indeed, which means we have two hands working against each other, yet aiming at the same prize, the erasure of Samuel. Bell's legacy." Holmes stood then, suddenly energized, and crossed the room to the writing desk. From its drawer, he extracted a heavy envelope and a blank telegram slip. "What are you planning?" He gave a thin smile. "A demonstration, one I dearly hope the world is not too deaf to hear." That afternoon, Holmes penned 3 letters, each addressed to different destinations, each bearing false yet alluring promises. The first went to Mr. Portman, inviting him to an urgent meeting regarding recent property claims on behalf of the Bell estate. The second was dispatched to Mr. Margrave himself, or rather, to his public secretary, indicating a leak had occurred within the solicitor's office regarding experimental prototypes thought destroyed. And the third He handed to me to Scotland Yard. I guessed. He shook his head. To the Times. Surely you don't intend to make this public, I said, startled. Only enough to bait them, he replied. We mention a mystery file, a pending inquiry, and a missing clerk presumed dead. Nothing more. Let the rumor take its own shape. If the trap is set correctly, all rats will rush for the same morsel. He arranged for all 3 messages to be dispatched from separate locations. By nightfall, London's invisible messengers were already in motion. Runners, messengers, gossiping servants, and intercepted telegrams spreading their intrigue. Holmes was pacing again by the fire. I've wagered everything, he said, more to himself than to me, on their pride, not their fear. The next evening, we returned to the office of Bell and Portman, this time with Lestrade. Waiting in the shadows of the opposite rooftop, 2 constables at his flanks. Holmes and I were inside, just beyond the unlocked main door, hidden in a chamber behind the filing cabinets. You're certain someone will come, I whispered. Holmes gave the faintest nod. They'll come because they need to know. No. What? Whether Thimbleby lived, whether someone still knows what Bell invented. And when they arrive, Holmes's eyes glittered in the dark. They will believe they've won. We didn't wait long. At precisely 9 o'clock, the outer door creaked open, a single set of footsteps. Not Portman, not Margrave, a third man, dressed like a clerk, but moving with the grace of someone who expected resistance. He carried a flat leather case and paused only once at the bell above the doorway. His fingers touched the edge. Then he moved inside. Holmes let him step fully into the room before striking the match. The flare illuminated his face. Not a stranger, after all. It was the assistant from Margrave's patent office we had seen. Him only briefly, trailing Margrave at a railway station weeks ago, delivering papers. A forgettable face, designed to be forgotten. Holmes stepped forward into the circle of lamplight. You won't find it, he said, quietly. The man froze. I don't know what you Holmes, cut him off. The original papers are in Scotland Yard custody. You're here not to retrieve them, but to ensure no copies remain. He gestured toward the case. What's inside? The man stood silent. Holmes approached slowly, methodically. Let me guess. Acid, or perhaps a burner device. Compact, efficient. I moved to block the door. The man dropped the case and lunged. There was a scuffle, brief, violent, and it ended with Holmes pressing the man's arm flat against the cabinet. From outside, a whistle blew. Lestrade and the constables rushed in. The man was restrained. The case opened. Inside, a strange copper cylinder, fitted with coiled wires and a faint chemical odor. Just as I thought, Holmes said. A paper incinerator, designed for silence and speed. Lestrade whistled. And if we'd waited 5 minutes longer, Bell's designs would have vanished forever. Holmes finished. We returned to Baker Street late that night. Holmes was unusually subdued. He refused supper and instead sat down at his desk, writing something I could not see. After some time, I approached him. Is it over? He didn't look up. It's interrupted, he said, but not over. Then who wins? He tapped the envelope with Bell's name on it. Whoever owns the silence. The following morning broke with a persistent drizzle that cast the streets in a shimmer of gray brass. I found Holmes already seated by the hearth, staring into the cold ashes as if trying to divine a meaning not yet revealed. His violin sat untouched on the divan, and for once the room bore the peculiar stillness of indecision. He did not acknowledge my entry. "Holmes," I began gently. "Lestrade said the man confessed to working for an intermediary. Little more to gain from him. We've set the trap, sprung it, and recovered the stolen information. What remains?" Holmes turned to me slowly. "And yet," he said, "we have no answer to the simplest question, which is—" He rose and crossed the room to the table, where a sheaf of the salvaged blueprints lay beside the copper incinerator canister. Holmes gestured toward the documents. "What," he asked softly, "did Bell invent that was worth killing for?" We had, to that point, accepted the blueprints as MacGuffin, the object around which the drama revolved, but not the drama itself. Yet, as Holmes now pointed out, nor replicated, they had tried only to erase it, which tells us, Holmes muttered, that this is not a competition of patents, it is a war of containment. Something Bell created posed a threat not to their profits, but to their secrecy. I examined one of the sketches, a cylindrical chamber coiled with copper filaments, some kind of communication device, I ventured. A variation on the electric telegraph. Holmes shook his head. Too crude. Look here, this emblem, repeated across every page. He pointed to a small symbol, a stylized bell, half-split, with radiating lines emerging from the gap. "Do you recognize it?" he asked. I admitted I did not. "Nor do I," he said. "And that, Watson, is what troubles me." Later that day, Holmes requested an audience with Miss Kendrew. She arrived quietly, her expression unreadable, and Holmes motioned for her to sit by the fire. I remained beside the window, notebook in hand. Miss Kendrew, Holmes began. "I must ask something of you which may seem strange, but I trust your instinct for truth." She inclined her head slightly, offering no resistance. "Do you believe Samuel Bell knew he was going to die?" There was a silence. Then she nodded. Double quotes. "Yes," she said. "Not at first, but by the end. Yes." "Why?" She looked at the rug, then up again. "He said he had done something wrong. Something that couldn't be undone, and that people were watching. People who didn't care if the world knew, only that it never understood." Holmes closed his eyes briefly. "And he left the designs with you?" "Yes, in case anything happened." Holmes leaned forward. "Did he ever tell you what they did?" Her hands trembled. "He said it could make something disappear, not just visually, but completely. A signal, he called it. A negative broadcast, like a bell that once rung, erased what had been there before." That evening, Holmes declined dinner. He sat instead at the window ledge, the blueprints strewn around him, muttering softly about electromagnetic interference and inverse pulses. When I pressed him, he waved me off. "I was wrong, Watson," he said. "This was never about fraud or invention. This was about memory, about the possibility of removing something, not from paper, but from history. A weapon." I asked. Holmes didn't answer, but the look in his eyes chilled me. It was not the thrill of pursuit, it was fear by nightfall. He had grown distant, not irritable, but internal. "I have missed something," he muttered, again and again. "Something obvious, too obvious." He began sorting through his notes with a frenzied precision, tracing dates, locations, Marginalia, 8 at last. He paused over a single folded telegram, one we had dismissed as a decoy days before. It had arrived unsigned from an untraceable post in Surrey. Bell didn't fail. He succeeded. That's why they silenced him. Holmes stared at the line as if it had only just revealed itself. Then he stood. "Watson, we go where?" He gave the faintest smile to see if the dead can still ring a bell. We took the late-night train from Waterloo under a pall of thickening fog. Holmes speaking little as the countryside passed in silent stretches of hedgerow and ghostly signals. I did not know our precise destination until we stepped off at Knave's Halt, a forgotten rural stop where even the lamps seemed uncertain of their purpose. Holmes led me past the station master's shuttered window, down a frost-hardened path and into the woods. "This is where Bell tested it," he murmured. "He called it the Wakefield clearing." "How do you know?" Holmes tapped his coat pocket. "His journal, the one we thought was destroyed." I stopped. "I thought the fire consumed everything." "Not everything," Holmes said grimly. "Thimbleby kept a duplicate, just in case Bell's paranoia proved well-founded. He left it in my care, anonymously, hours before he vanished the first time. I only decoded it this morning, and you waited until now to tell me." Holmes glanced back, just briefly, because I wasn't sure, because I needed to believe I was wrong. The clearing revealed itself like a wound in the forest, unnaturally circular, its center scorched and stubbled with frost-blasted grass. At its heart stood a blackened wooden frame, like the remains of a bell tower stripped bare. Holmes crouched beside it. "This," he said, "was where Bell's final prototype rang." I looked around. "It doesn't appear to have done anything." Holmes reached into his satchel and removed a compact metal box, roughly the size of a dictionary, fitted with dials and a cracked glass panel. "Then let's see what memory tells us." What followed was, in all my years with Holmes, the most unnerving experiment I had ever witnessed. He activated the device. A low thrum filled the clearing, deep and humming, like the breath of a beast beneath the soil. The trees trembled faintly. The very air seemed to withdraw, and then dash nothing. No flash, no smoke, just silence. But it wasn't empty. It was missing. Holmes stood frozen, staring at a point just beyond my shoulder. "Watson," he whispered, "the marker stone." I turned. "What marker?" "There was a stone here," he said, voice tight. "It was in Bell's notes. A marker, placed at the center, inscribed with his father's name. It should be." He stepped forward. His boot struck nothing but frost. "Gone." He turned to me, pale. "Do you understand?" I nodded slowly. Unsure I did. "You think Bell built something that could erase objects, not just objects," Holmes said. "Memory, evidence, presence, as if something was plucked, not from time, but from consensus. It's not invisibility. It's denial." A sudden chill passed through me. "You think they've used it?" Holmes didn't respond. We returned to London just before dawn. Holmes was silent the entire way, his fingers drumming against the edge of the bench in an unbroken rhythm. Once home, he went directly to his archive drawers, those ancient, dust-choked troves of every newspaper clipping, court transcript, and field report he'd collected across the years. "Help me," he said, simply. We worked in silence, rifling through records of the Bell estate, court proceedings, patent trials, society columns, and then "Holmes," I said, holding up a clipping. It was a photograph. A group portrait at the 1899 Royal Inventors Symposium. Bell stood at the center, flanked by Portman and Margrave. Holmes took the clipping from me and turned to his bookshelf. He removed a thick blue volume, the Compendium of British Scientific Societies, and flipped to the same symposium's entry. There was the same photograph, only this time Bell was not in it. We sat in silence. Holmes held both images side by side. His jaw clenched. "They've begun using it," he said, "not just to silence inventors, but to rewrite their very presence." I was too stunned to reply. He looked at me, then truly looked, and for the first time I saw something like helplessness in Sherlock Holmes. "This isn't about invention anymore," he said. "It's about narrative, control, erasure, not of the event, but of the idea that it ever mattered." I asked what we should do. Holmes did not answer. He returned to his desk and, with the trembling delicacy of a man holding an unexploded device, began writing. A single envelope on its surface, to be delivered. "If I am forgotten." The letter sat upon the mantelpiece for nearly 2 days before Holmes moved it again, and even then it wasn't to send it, only to seal it in red wax and place it inside a hollowed-out volume of Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. "I trust your medical instincts, Watson," he said, without looking up. "But I trust contingency more." I did not press him. There was a change in Holmes, not merely in his temperament, though he was notably more subdued, but in his posture, his eyes. He had always been lean and electric, but now he held himself like a man stepping carefully along an unseen edge, fearful not of falling, but of being pushed. It was that same afternoon when the bell rang, the true bell, not a prototype, not a machine, but the dull clatter of our Baker Street door. Mrs. Hudson answered, and soon appeared at the study, with an ashen face. "There's a gentleman," she said hesitantly. "He says he knows the doctor." Holmes nodded to me once. "Go." I descended the stairs, expecting an old patient or colleague, but it was neither. Standing in the entryway was a man in a black overcoat, with no hat, rain shining off his shoulders, and a gaze that felt like a scalpel. "Dr. Watson," he said, coolly. "May we speak?" I hesitated, then stepped aside. He did not remove his gloves. He did not offer a name. He did not sit. "I am here," he said, "because Mr. Holmes has been asking questions about Mr. Samuel Bell." I remained silent. "Your inquiries have registered." He said it the way a magistrate might mention a death warrant. "What is your interest in Mr. Bell?" I asked. The man gave the faintest tilt of his head. "None," he said, "and that is precisely the point." Reached into his coat. Holmes entered the room before I could flinch. "I wouldn't," he said softly. The man froze. His hand paused inside the coat, then withdrew, empty. "I came only to advise," he said evenly. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes, but cleverness has gravity. It attracts attention." Holmes stepped forward until they were inches apart. "And yet," he said, "you arrived with none." The two men stood like statues, eyes locked. Then the stranger stepped back. "There is no threat here," he said, "only a reminder. Mr. Bell died of his own mind. That is the story." Holmes said nothing. The man turned toward the door, but before he reached it, Holmes spoke again. "You said is. You didn't say Bell was." The man paused. Holmes smiled faintly. "A curious mistake, if he's dead." The man didn't look back. I misspoke. Holmes nodded. No, you didn't. After he had gone, I turned to Holmes. You think Bell is alive? I think, Holmes said, that someone is still editing him. And when a memory requires that much maintenance, it rarely stays buried. He returned to the desk and retrieved the envelope he had sealed days before. Then, very calmly, he tore it open and began writing something new. That night, Holmes left. He told me he had an errand, unspecified, urgent, and not to be followed. When I awoke the next morning, he had not returned. The fire had burned out. The windows were frost-rimmed, and in place of breakfast, I found a telegram. If I am not back by midnight, assume contact failed. Widen the inquiry. Trust only paper. Burn everything else. S.H. I waited the entire day. Mrs. Hudson kept bringing me tea. I never drank. I scanned the papers, questioned the telegraph boy, even walked the block 6 times. Nothing. When the clock struck 12, I lit the hearth, sat at the writing desk, and began a list of every person who had touched the Bell case. It was nearly 2 hours later, long after even London's gas lamps had dimmed, that I heard a faint knock. Holmes entered slowly. He was soaked, his coat torn at the hem, and one sleeve was stained with something dark, not quite blood, not quite ink. He said nothing as I helped him off with the coat, but he placed a package gently on the floor, a small wooden box, sealed with iron clasps and bound in twine. Inside, resting atop a folded telegram and a copper tuning fork, was a single metal bell. UNTARNISHED, uncracked and still ringing faintly, though no one had touched it. It is an extraordinary sensation to hear a bell that makes no sound, not in the ordinary sense, but a kind of pressure that gathers behind the eyes and hums through the ribs. The bell Holmes placed before me was not ringing, and yet I heard it, not with my ears, with something deeper, more primal, as though memory itself had been set to vibrate. He offered no explanation at first. He merely sat in the armchair across from the fire, coat steaming, eyes unreadable. It came from the well-water vault, he said eventually, hidden behind the crypt of Reverend Aldgate in Kennington Parish. How did you know where to look? I didn't, he replied, but the stranger last night left a partial fingerprint on your doorframe, tallow and machine oil, specific only to men who service gaswork tunnels or handle delicate clockwork in high humidity conditions. Bell's journal referenced buried acoustics, a place where the resonance of his prototypes could be contained. He turned to the box. This one was marked differently. It has a date engraved on the clapper, December 13th, 1904. That's tomorrow. I said nothing. The fire flickered, and outside, a distant carriage rumbled past Baker Street. Then Holmes did something I had not seen him do in many years. He hesitated, not the theatrical sort, not a pause for effect or drama, but a genuine uncertainty, as though the next move on the chessboard might no longer obey the rules. There are times, he said quietly, when the answer is not to stop the bell from ringing, but to decide who must hear it. What followed was a flurry of telegrams. Holmes sent missives to every corner of his network. Mycroft, Lestrade, even an obscure retired linguist in Wiltshire, who apparently once deciphered coded canticles written in mirror script for the Vatican. I watched as Holmes pieced together fragments, not of a man or a machine, but of an event yet to happen. By mid-afternoon, he had what he needed. The location, a private hall beneath Chancery Lane. The attendees, members of the Bureau, masked and nameless. The purpose, demonstration. The bell would be rung again, but this time, Holmes would be there to listen. That evening, I accompanied him as far as the alley behind the Barristers' Club. He refused to let me follow further. "I need someone remembering me, Watson," he said. "That may prove more important than having someone at my side," I protested. Naturally, but there was a steel in his voice. Not cold, not unkind, but resolute. He disappeared into the stone corridor, trenchcoat disappearing behind a wrought iron gate. What transpired inside that chamber, I learned only hours later. When Holmes returned, pale but intact, with soot on his cuffs and a fresh cut across his cheek. "There was no demonstration," he said. I looked up from my writing desk. "They dismantled it." He shook his head. "They never arrived." Holmes placed an envelope on the table. Inside were 3 photographs, each taken from an upper window overlooking Chancery Lane. In the first, a coach arrives bearing a masked man. In the second, 2 more figures approach. In the third, there is no one, not a man, not a coach, not a shadow. Even the tracks in the snow are gone. "They were erased en route," Holmes said. "The bell was activated early, likely by one of their own, to silence them, to remove them from the board," he replied. No court, but what Holmes said next chilled me deeper than the snow outside. "The bell you now see on our table," he whispered, "has already been rung. Looked at it, polished, still, silent. But it hasn't," he interrupted. "That's what they want us to believe. That we begin to doubt our own recollections." He held up a letter. "It arrived this morning. No sender. But in it were 3 names, yours, mine. Moved slightly, just enough that no one would notice, just enough that I would begin to wonder if I had ever been there at all." Holmes saw the look on my face and nodded gravely. "The bell did not fail, Watson. It chose. By midnight, the box had vanished from our rooms. Holmes claimed he destroyed it. I am not so sure. Some silences, after all, ring forever." It was 2 nights after the vanishing at Chancery Lane when Holmes, finally still, finally silent, drew the curtains shut and poured us both a measure of whiskey from a decanter I hadn't seen in years. He placed the bell, or what was left of it, in the center of the table between us. Its once resonant interior was blackened, as if scorched. Still, even in ruin, it seemed to hum with a faint, uneasy charge, like a gun that had been recently fired. "I owe you the full picture, Watson," Holmes said. He didn't sound weary, he sounded finished. "Let us begin where this case truly began. Not with Miss Vernon's visit, nor even with Mr. Samuel Bell's death, but with a single advertisement that ran in the Times 2 years ago, seeking mechanical minds for soundless resonance studies. That ad," Holmes continued, "was not placed by any academic institute, but by a pseudonymous entity known as the Office for Auditory Reconnaissance. In truth, this was merely a front, a fishing net, thrown out by a covert bureau whose true aim was to study the neurological and emotional effects of sound-induced memory manipulation." I blinked. "Memory manipulation?" Holmes nodded. "The bell, Watson, was never just a prototype for a mechanical alarm. It was a mnemonic device, one that exploited the auditory system's direct line to the hippocampus. Each strike of that bell could reinforce or diminish specific memories in its vicinity, depending on the resonant frequency and the subject's brain chemistry. I felt my stomach turn. "You mean, yes," Holmes said quietly. "It could erase memory, selectively, surgically. But what happened to Bell?" Holmes steepled his fingers. Samuel Bell was a brilliant man, but as with many inventors, he lacked both the ruthlessness and the secrecy required by his handlers. He began to question the ethics of the project. His designs grew erratic. He introduced unpredictable variables into the bell's frequencies, out of protest, or perhaps as sabotage. Holmes leaned back. They tried to manage him, at first through threats. But Bell did something they didn't expect. He ran. Holmes shook his head. Worse, he encoded his final bell with a self-detonating mnemonic. I stared. A what? An idea so destabilizing that to remember it would collapse the subject's ability to trust their own memories, like a cognitive virus. Miss Vernon, when she visited us, she had already been exposed. That's why she doubted herself. That's why she kept forgetting details mid-sentence. He tapped the ruined bell. This was the last of them, and it was meant to ring itself a delayed strike, tied to a physical or emotional trigger. But it didn't, I said. Holmes turned to me. No, he whispered. It already had. He stood and retrieved from his desk drawer a small card, yellowed and creased. I found this in the bell's housing chamber, he said. It was left by Bell himself. You've forgotten. A silence passed between us that no bell could break. Holmes poured another measure, but didn't drink. The Bureau didn't silence Bell by killing him. They did something far more elegant. They erased him from context, from records, from memory. And yet, I said slowly, he left that bell. Precisely, said Holmes, the final proof of his rebellion. And its mere presence was enough to summon them back, to bury him again. There will be no arrests, no confessions, no courtroom scenes. This was a crime of reality, not law. And the only way to solve it was to survive the forgetting long enough to name it. He raised his glass. To those who hear what was not, said I drank with him, not because I understood all of it, not because I accepted all of it, I could not, but because in that moment I believed that some cases are not solved with justice, only with memory. The case had concluded, or so Holmes said. Life at Baker Street returned to its usual rhythms. The post came at 7. Holmes resumed his correspondence with the Royal Society. I attended to a few lingering patients and began drafting the public version of the affair, stripped of the more unbelievable elements. The bell, of course, was gone. So too was any record of Miss Vernon, but I could not shake a feeling that lingered just beneath the skin of the world, like a splinter buried too deep to remove. Then, one fog-bound morning, I received a letter. No name, no return address, just my full name in tight block capitals. Dr.J.H. Watson, 221B, Baker Street Inn, side. A folded slip of paper, a short sentence. There are 3 bells left. I brought it to Holmes at once. He held it to the lamp, checked for watermarks, measured the spacing of the letters. No fingerprints, he muttered. No known watermark, or typewritten, of course, and not with a commercial model. He did not say what I was thinking, that this meant someone else had resisted the erasure, or worse, that someone had survived it. "There are 3 bells left," I repeated. Then the project wasn't ended with Bell. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he turned from the window, his face unreadable. "I suspect," he said, "that the project never ended. Only the need to tell us did." I stared at him. "Then why the letter?" He gave a faint smile. "Perhaps they want us to know. Or perhaps they want us to remember something else entirely." That evening, Holmes did something rare. He opened the old trunk beneath his cot, the one where he kept only his most disturbing or unresolved cases, and added the note. No label, no index card, just the letter. Slipped inside a folder that read only "Rings that weren't heard." And 4 nights afterward, I found myself listening differently. 2 door chimes, 2 carriage bells, to the striking of clocks across the rooftops of London. I listened not for sound, but for intent, for the silent messages stitched into tones, for the idea that a bell might ring not to signal time, but to alter it. "There are 3 bells left," the letter had said. "Where they are, I do not know. Who holds them, I cannot say, but I will be listening. There is one detail I did not include in the public account of this affair. One thing I have hidden, not out of deceit, but necessity. You see, the bell did ring, not once, but twice, and I heard it, not at the church in Chancery Lane, not during Holmes's deduction, but later, in our own sitting room, after the case had closed and the fire had died down to shadows. It was faint, hollow, impossible, but I heard it, and in that instant, something in my memory shifted, just slightly, like a book moved a few inches on a shelf. I went to my desk and opened the drawer where I keep my field journals. I flipped to the pages covering our investigation of the Bell notes taken in my own hand just days prior. Only they were not in my handwriting. They were in type, the exact same mechanical type as the anonymous letter. I called for Holmes at once, but when he entered the room and saw the pages, he did not look surprised. He merely nodded and said, "It happened to me as well." I pressed him. How long had he known? Why hadn't he told me? His reply was quiet. "Because if we forget the forgetting, Watson, then perhaps we keep what little we still know." He showed me then a page from one of his case ledgers, blank, except for 3 small dots in the upper left corner, burn marks. 3. "Each bell," he said, "was struck once. That's how we'll know if another one sounds." "And if we hear it again?" I asked. He gave the smallest shrug. "Then perhaps we won't remember this conversation at all." Since then, I have begun to notice other absences, faces that look familiar in crowds, but vanish before I can place them. Photographs with smudged names. A distant echo of a case I once believed we solved, but can no longer locate in any journal. I begin to suspect that our world is full of such bells, not always mechanical. Some are words, some are silences, some are tones in music or shouts. In dreams, each one softly peeling away a thread from the mind, unraveling us while we continue to smile, shake hands, speak, and write. That is why I have written this version, not for the newspapers, nor for Scotland Yard. This is for you, reader, whoever you are, whenever you are, because you may find yourself one day reaching for a name that once meant something to you and finding only dust. And if you do, know that it is not your fault. Know that someone wanted you to forget, and that someone else, perhaps Holmes, perhaps me, tried to leave you a thread. I have hidden a duplicate of this manuscript, where, I will not say here, but it exists. And if it is found one day, in a time that no longer remembers Holmes or Watson, or Samuel Bell or Miss Vernon, let it remind you of this: memory is not a luxury. It is not a tool. It is not a thing to be shaped by those in power. It is who we are, and we must guard it, even from ourselves. Dr. John H. Watson, Baker Street, London, a year I am no longer entirely certain of.